Hey everyone, welcome to Conf42 Site Reliability Engineering Conference. My name is Peter Detender, and I'm going to walk you through Azure load testing. Now, before diving into the actual topic, let me share a bit about myself. So, Peter Detender, originally from Belgium, but moved to the Redmond area about 3 years ago, where I'm working as a Microsoft technical trader at Microsoft. I think it's still one of the easiest job titles within Microsoft because what I'm doing is providing technical training on our Microsoft Azure platform primarily to our top customers across the globe using virtual online workshops. My career started about 30 years ago as a physical technical engineer, literally building physical data centers, the cabling, the cooling, and then gradually, as part of my career, moved up the solution stack, you could say, all the way from that physical data center, networking, storage, servers, and then gradually moving up to cloud, where around 2013 picked up Azure for the full 100%, and then moved a bit from cloud engineering to cloud architecting, a lot of DevOps automation, and gradually developing an AI over the last 3 years. You got all my contact details here, and feel free, I would say, to reach out if you should have any questions while watching the session, or obviously, if you're watching this later on as a recording, then more than happy to provide you with an answer. Now, the starting point is, what is SRE, right? Now, knowing that the core topic of the conference today is all about site reliability engineering, now where does my Azure load testing fit? So to me, SRE, if you think about what you're doing, and again, don't feel personally attacked about this, it might be totally different in your case, but to me, site reliability engineering means you're gonna spend a huge amount of time on stress testing. Why stress testing? Because your goal as an SRE is making sure that your environment, your workload within Azure, outside of Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, on-prem, not important where the workload is running, your goal is making it as high available, redundant as possible. The way to do that is typically hammering your environment using load testing. So to be the perfect example to talk about load testing in Azure as part of the SRE conference. So what is load testing, first of all? This is a sort of, I think, formal definition that I found online. Load testing is a type of performance testing that determines the performance of a system, a software, an application, or a full workload if you want, under, and that's important, real life, real workload-based load conditions, which typically would be the number of users, number of sessions, maybe the amount of traffic. If you have a lot of streaming data, like a Netflix maybe, or something similar, streaming media, where all of a sudden the traffic could become more important than actual number of users. From here, we move into Azure load testing. So obviously the assumption here is that you're going to run your workload on top of the Azure platform. Where now we have a service in the platform, managed service, called Azure load testing. Yes, every now and then, Azure service names actually do make sense. Azure load testing is a managed service that can be used to, again, simulate load. Preferably, I would say you're going to run this against your production environment, or even more so, you're going to run this in your test acceptance staging environment because you don't want to impact your production all the way. From there, you're going to target application user interface like an app service, a web application, or a virtual machine, and why not API endpoints. As long as you can target your backend using HTTPS, you're actually good to go. Now, there's one part to testing, like going in the portal. No surprise, I'm going to walk you through some live demos there, where we have an application up and running. You're going to integrate Azure load testing. You're going to use the Azure portal for now. You're going to click around, and then you're going to build your test. But that's like a one-time shot or a manual shot. Out of SRE, I guess we can all agree that a big part of your job is also automating your tasks. So that's where the second bullet point becomes quite important. You're going to build your tests, initially manual and then gradually automating the whole process. And the good news is you can trigger Azure load testing as part of your CI/CD pipelines. A lot of flexibility where you're going to define test criteria, and I'll show you again in a demo how that works. And then also crucial to mention here is that initially 2 years ago, load testing in Azure was based on the Apache open source JMeter framework. In meantime, it also supports Locust, where you're going to hear about some differences between the both scenarios. But the cool thing is, you manage the Azure environment, you're going to bring in one of the two options to really configure your testing. Next to that, what do we need as part of our load testing definitions? I call this here the load testing components. You need a load testing resource, literally a top-level resource providing you centralized place to view your testing. What it means is go to Azure Load Testing as the service, and that's becoming your dashboard for all testing scenarios. Next to that, obviously, you need a test, you need a test run. A test means it's a technical definition. The run means we actually gonna execute the test. The test engine is the compute infrastructure in the backend. This could be your target instance. And then last, you need an application component. Again, any possible HTTP, HTTPS, reachable backend from within Azure would be a possible scenario. Next, we have load testing test itself. So again, URL-based is one option. The easiest one I'll show you as the starting point of my demo. Give me URL and I'm going to simulate testing. Obviously not anything that's running outside of your control. Second option, to maybe make it a little bit more standardized, or maybe even a bit more advanced if you want, is using that Apache JMeter testing script. You're going to build your testing typically offline, not really using the Azure portal anymore. Or why not, maybe you have a mixed environment across different clouds, but also on-prem, where now you're going to rely on that JMeter framework. Now, the JMeter framework has some specific characteristics to it, like the GMX files you need, like a XML, YAML-alike scenario, where you're going to provide all the elements, like the controllers, the timing, the assumptions, assertions, and listeners that you want to use as part of your testing. Now, the second option, or the third actually, is using Locust as a, I would say, popular testing framework as well. The big difference between JMeter and Locust is obviously it's not an Apache framework, but next to that, it also relies on Python coding instead of the GMX files. So same concept, slightly different framework. That's the summarization of it. And then what I also mentioned during the introduction is now we have our tests and we're going to automate it. Where the good news is that at least out of the Microsoft DevOps solutions, which means Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, you can integrate your Azure load testing scenarios as part of an already pre-built marketplace component. You build your pipelines in the exact same way as you already have, CI or CD, why not combining? And in Azure DevOps, you're going to bring in a pre-built marketplace component called Azure Load Test. If you're no longer using Azure DevOps, but it's all happening on the GitHub side, that's where you're going to bring in GitHub Actions. And again, no surprise, you have a GitHub Actions marketplace component called Azure/load testing. And for now, it's still version 1. And then you go, okay, Peter, we're not using Azure DevOps. We're not using GitHub Actions. What are the options? Good news is, since Azure load testing is just another service in the Azure platform, it means you can target it, you can trigger it using traditional REST API calls. I might not have enough time in this session to show you all three options, but at least I'm going to shift to the next part, and that's really showing you how all this works. I'm going to start with deploying load testing. I'm going to show you one of my sample backends, it's just a wrap-up, and then from there, triggering a manual test or configuring and triggering a manual test, showing you the JMeter option as well as the Locust framework to give you some touching points. And then again, if time allows, I'm going to show you how you could integrate it as part of your DevOps solutions. See you back in a bit. So here I'm in my Azure portal where I'm going to use the Azure load testing. Now again, I call this a managed service, which means you don't have to install anything. It's already available within your Azure environment. You could obviously create a new load testing from here, but to speed up the demo a little bit, I'm going to use the one that I already have. If you're a bit into Azure, which I assume you are, It's just like any other Azure resource. You define the location, you provide a name, a resource group, and off you go. So that's mainly what I did here. Once we have our load testing service configured, that's where we're going to use some of its capabilities. You can start with a couple of different scenarios. The first one I'll use is over here, where I'm going to add HTTP requests. So I'm going to select create a new test, and this is now what we call the URL-based test. I can provide a name. I'm just going to accept the defaults, or let's call this one the live URL test, a description, live URL test. How hard can it be? Run the test right after creation. And if you want, you can see here debugging mode, which is going to give you access to debug logging. If a test is running, but it's failing, it's not doing what it needs to do, then I would say, please enable this. Enable advanced settings is just going to give you access to more options down here. Let's move on to the next step. I'm going to add a new request. And again, later on, if this is no longer the first test you're creating, or you know how the Apache framework is working, then you could also start from an input data file. I'm going to create a new request. I'm going to accept all the defaults because it's not all that important for now. And I'm going to use input in a UI. What this means is my request name. So this would be, let's say, homepage, HTTP get, and my URL is my website. I'm going to use my production blog website, 07ffflearning.com. And what is the HTTP method? Now from here, I'm going to take a minute to highlight a few things. Right here, I'm connecting to the homepage. Now, if let's say your homepage is your product retail catalog, or in my case, my blog website, it might all be fine, but what if I want to go to a lower level? Then from here, you could actually add the subset. Like in my case, I have a section on my blog that talks about the books that I wrote in the past. And I want to run a test against my books subsection and not the homepage. From here, I could move on. Like the default would be a get comment, but as you can see, we're respecting all REST API calls. Imagine you have, again, like a product retail, you want to test the performance impact when you're uploading products, when you're ordering products, when you trigger a payment, when you're making changes to the site and so on. That's what you can define here, but I'm not going to make it that complex in my demo scenario. So I'm going to trigger a get. You can fine-tune query parameters like injecting specific variables. You can tune the headers and maybe even looking into response variables. Again, just showing you the options, what are all the capabilities, and we can make this super straightforward, super easy, or rather complex. Nothing blocks you from combining multiple tests, so I could do second URL request, where now I could go back to the same endpoint, or why not going to a different endpoint. So this could be my sample Azure web app.azurewebsites.net. Because what if my website homepage has dependencies on other websites? And again, using some other URL REST API call here. And then building up a flow of tests on the request side. It's going to run the first request, the second, the third. How many you want to add into it, that's up to you. Clicking next onto the next cycle, where we can define different parameters. Environment variables, hopefully pretty obvious. Based on a variable, this could be dev and test staging production. Using secrets, imagine that you want to connect, like again, the retail example I mentioned. Maybe you want to connect to a database, you want to interact with Key Vault, you want to interact with connection strings. You can define it here. And obviously the same for certificate. If you interact with Key Vault, our Azure secret store, the idea is obviously that your testing framework, your running test, now also needs permissions to interact with Key Vault. And that's what's down here, where preferably following Microsoft best practice, we're expecting you to define managed identity, define role-based access for this specific test, getting the necessary permissions to hook into Key Vault. At the same time, it's not only locking down permissions, but it's also defining them in a granular, zero trust approach, you could say. Moving on to the next, that's where we're going to define the actual load simulation. Number of instances, like how many simulations, but also how much compute, and that's where the scaling details here would be beneficial. Each and every engine allows you to run up to 250 user sessions. So if you have, I want to simulate 1,000 users, it means you need 4 instances. I'm quite limited, although technically I could move this up, but my subscription doesn't allow me to do this physically or technically. So I'm going to stay with 2. I'm going to move up my numbers to 350. We're now telling them, oh, wait a minute, it can only be 250. So that's a bit confusing. 250 here means 2 instances. I'm still going to simulate 500 users. So just trying to clarify the portal a little bit. I want linear growth. I want a step-by-step growth, and you can see that the parameters are changing. And you could also simulate spike, where we start with 250 concurrent users and then gradually spiking, like simulating literally a CPU spike or a user spike, like we got more users coming in because we offer like some online food ordering platform, and it's between 6 and 7. We see a spike for breakfast, it's between 11:30 and 1. We see a spike for lunch ordering coming in. That's the scenario you could simulate here. I'm going to keep the default of linear, and that should be good enough. Do you want to integrate monitoring? What this means here is that we provide you monitoring dashboard, but now you could actually hook into other Azure scenarios. You could use application insights, storing data in there. You could configure some other options, and you can see it from here. Moving on, we can define even more specific test criteria. You can define the conditions, like if for this specific metric, like response time, there's an aggregation if the condition is true, do this, do that. So again, showing you more options, more granular configuration parameters. The baseline technically would be the same thing. All that summarized in the last overview, and we're going to create our test. Now, although I started from the HTTP URL based, you can see that now by design, it's using a JMeter script. What it's technically doing here is transforming all my settings from the portal into that JMeter framework language. It's going to take a couple of seconds to actually create that test. And once it's done, we're going to move over and we have our testing ready. So to speed up my demo again a little bit, I already have one from 2 days ago. As you can see here, I got my test, I got all my scheduling done. I'm not scheduling anything, but that could be another SRE trick here to build a test, run a test, but then also scheduling the test, run this every hour, run this overnight, and whatnot. And then last here, we're going to run our test itself. When we run the test, this is already done because it's going to typically take 5 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on the timeline of the testing you want to go through. This was a pretty short one, only 2 minutes, because I don't want to wait for it to just show you some results. And what it gives me here is that linear growth. So this one was a bit smaller. Move up to 50 users, start small, gradually move up, and then hammer my platform. I used HTTP GET, and then it's going to show me the outcomes of it. Response time in this case, the number of requests, and then obviously the go-to scenario would be to add an additional level of tests, changing the parameters, maybe running the test again with a different app service backend and whatnot. And then it also shows me some server-side metrics, but this has not been configured. What I would need to do here is what I showed you before, enabling application insights. Application insights is where you're going to hook into Azure Log Analytics, allowing you to store all the metric data, not only visible in the portal, but actually storing the actual telemetry information and allowing you to, again, do data mining, data viewing out of that. And that's where the server-side metric comes in, because it's relying on some other framework there. Next to that, I can download my input file, the logs, the results. I'm going to show you the input file. Why? Because this is what I need to show you that JMeter framework. It's not the best tool. but I'm going to use it for now, just opening an easy notepad document. And then I could normally not drag and drop, obviously not, because it's, what am I doing, Notepad? No, Peter, you don't need Notepad. You need Visual Studio Code to do this. And then I guess I can drop it. It's in my downloads. It looks a bit weird, but eventually it shows up as we expected. So this is the JMeter config file. So it has the display name, what kind of test plan. And as you can see here, there's a pointer to the actual JSON file. It's what you see here, looks a little bit awkward because for some reason it's not respecting the JSON layout, but you can see that it has that syntax. And then the last one is the actual GMX file. Oh, there we go. We could do actually Notepad, but that's fine. And this is that XML structure that I talked about before. So it's going to show you like all the details. Let's see if I can find some of the settings from my configuration here. So it's HTTP, that's what we picked. We had HTTP GET, that's fine. And this is where I would say go into the documentation of the Apache JMeter. The nice thing again is that now since we exported this, I could technically close this because I don't need it anymore. I could now go in and actually upload a new test. So if I take one step back, create new test, upload a script, it's going to ask me like, okay, where do you have your files? It's JMeter, it's in my local file system, it's in my repos, it's anywhere you want to store it, and then you don't have to go through the portal anymore. So URL test, JMeter, it's technically almost the same thing. I would say use that JMeter scenario for the more advanced configuration options. The other example we have is Locust. So again, what is Locust? It's right down here. I got another little demo that I built. Everything that I talked you through is exactly the same thing. I'm selecting a test, I'm running a test. The main difference here is using a different framework. The nice thing again is that within our Azure load testing, it's using the same Azure approach to give you that capability. Same testing, same ease of use, same advanced configuration, more granular options, just using a different framework. You might have used JMeter in another cloud, in an on-prem world. You might standardize on Locust. That's the philosophy behind it. What is the main difference? I would say it's the configuration. This is my Locust Python script that I used for this test. And as you can see here, it's using Python scripting language to define the details of your scripting. It's connecting to my workload. It's a get workload. It's pulling up a to-do item, and then it's reading out a response to validate if the response was 200, retrieve the response, and so on, using Python, traditional Python scripting language. Running the test, seeing the output of the test, it's the exact same experience. So loading about 500 users for 5 minutes, and then reading out the results. And again, the dashboarding views are technically the same thing. Next, I talked about using DevOps mindset. So the example I have here is connecting to DevOps. I could show you GitHub Actions as well, but I'm still a lot more into Azure DevOps, I guess, out of my background. Been playing with DevOps for, 10, 15 years. So Team Foundation server was my playground. I got my to-do items, the one that I published in my pipeline, and then in here, what's relevant, apart from the fact that it didn't run successful, but it's because I didn't configure the correct permissions. This is one single stage. So this would be part of your CI build pipeline, right? Where you're going to CI/CD pipeline, where you're going to define the service connection into Azure. What is the name of the load test? What is the resource group? And then from there, you're going to use this pre-built Azure load test concept. It needs a load testing config file. So the YAML file from JMeter, as I showed you, the resource group, and then from there, not really needing anything else. Super straightforward. How can you install this extension? You go into the Visual Studio Marketplace. I think it's marketplace.visualstudio.com. There we go. And you're going to search for Azure load testing. It's going to ask you like, where do you want to install this as part of what Azure DevOps organization? You download it, you install it, and that's where it becomes available. If you go, okay, that's all cool, but can you show me how to do this in GitHub Actions? Although I don't have it up running configured, you would go into repo, you would go into actions, and then here you would search for load testing. I think it's one word, maybe two, load. What happened here? Load. Oh, it's not the full action, obviously. It's a component within. It should be here. Azure load testing. And then picking the right version or the latest version. That's up to you. And then as you can see from my slides, Azure load testing, and then asking again for the same configuration data, the JMex file, the YAML file, the config file in JSON format, which most probably is already part of your repo anyway, and then running your pipeline just like any other component. The last scenario we have, I have it somewhere on the side, is running it using traditional REST API calls. And I'm just going to grab the little sample code that I have for that. Just give me a second here. That's what happens when you do all this live, right? It would look a little bit like this. So first you're going to authenticate into Azure. Next, it's going to create that authentication token. And from there, traditional REST API, curly, post, get anything you want to do with it. HTTP, oh, I'm sorry, this is obviously the post because you're triggering the load testing itself. Point to your load testing endpoint using the token and then defining the header and the actual details, where again, it's pointing to your script GMX file. In this case, it's a JMeter example. And then running the actual test is again running curl post, and then you're going to run the actual test cycle here. 3 different scenarios, 3 different options, pretty much anything I wanted to talk about in this 30-minute session. Looking at the clock, I can see that I'm almost running out of time. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation and closing with the last couple of words. Awesome. So that worked pretty fine. Now we're close to the end of my session, but allow me to actually fine-tune or close my session with a couple of last words, where one of the last things I want to highlight here is that Azure load testing is only one of, I would say, our Azure mission critical components. The second option, as you can see here, is Azure Chaos Studio, allowing you to do chaos engineering against your Azure running workloads. If you want to find more details about how this technically works, what are the Microsoft guidelines, the best practices on building out this sort of mission critical workload scenario, I would say go to this GitHub link where you find all documentation, including samples, including sample testing and chaos experiments. With that, I'm at the end of my session time for now. So thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. Again, enjoy the rest of the SRE conference here today. If you got any questions, don't hesitate reaching out by email, on Twitter, maybe on LinkedIn if you want to stay in touch, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for now, and see you again at some other Conf42 conference in the near future. Enjoy the rest of your day.